Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in our series Bringing Data to Life. My name is Beth and I work at the Office for National Statistics. Thank you for joining us today for our beginners webinar on house and rent price statistics. Before we start, we'd like to remind you that all the webinars in this series are recorded and they're available on YouTube after the event. The slides and recordings for our previous webinars are now available on the ONS website. Everyone signed up to this webinar will receive a link once today's recording is available. You'll also receive an email this afternoon with links to any of the tools and articles that we mention. If you're using the Microsoft Teams app and you would like to turn on live captions for this webinar, please click on the More button across the top of your screen. For those of you who haven't used this before, it's the button with 3 dots to the left of your camera button. And once you've clicked More, scroll down to Languages and Speech and then select the option to show live captions. The chat function is closed, but we welcome your questions through Slido, and I'll cover this in more detail in just a moment. This webinar series is for everyone, so please share the recording and slides when they're available and join the conversation on social media by using the hashtag statistics for the public good. Lastly, you'll be invited to complete a short survey at the end of today's webinar, and we'd really welcome your feedback on the webinar series and the statistics we produce. The session today is interactive with some questions for you, and you can ask questions for our speakers throughout the event. We'll have time to answer as many questions as possible in our Q&A section after the presentations. Please join by scanning the QR code on your screen or heading over to slido.com and using the code hashtag BDTLhousing. If you're using the desktop Microsoft Teams app, you can click the S Slido button at the top of your screen and Slido will appear. And the Slido code will appear in the footer of every slide, so don't worry if you miss it. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We'll first hear from Chris Jenkins and Amy North from the ONS. Chris and Amy will explain how we typically measure inflation and why housing indices are a little more difficult to measure. They'll explain how we calculate our housing price indices and then provide a demonstration of our housing prices tool so you can see the latest average house prices and monthly private rental prices for your local area and how they have changed over time. We're also pleased to be joined by Gary Trent from the Valuation Office Agency, or VOA. Gary Trent is the private rented sector stakeholder lead for the VOA. His role is working with stakeholders across the private rented sector to help improve the quality and efficiency of the rental data that's used in the ONS private rent prices statistics. Gary will give you some background and insight into the data collection behind the rental statistics. Thank you once again for joining us, and I'll now hand over to Chris to get us started.
Thanks, Beth, and good afternoon, everyone. As Beth has already said, my name is Chris Jenkins. I'm Assistant Deputy Director of Prices Division within the ONS. So I'm responsible for the publication of our inflation measures, of which housing is an important component. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So I'll just give a very brief overview of what we produce in terms of inflation indices at the ONS. So inflation can be defined as the rate of increase in prices over a given period of time. So inflation is very important. Firstly, it tells us how much the prices of goods and services are increasing or decreasing. It is also important as an indicator of an economy's health, where governments and central banks use, for example, the Consumer Price Index to make economic or monetary policy decisions. So at the ONS, we measure inflation from a number of different perspectives. Firstly, from the consumer perspective. So how much of the goods or services that we are buying increasing or decreasing? And we also try to break this down by how inflation affects different household groups, such as pensioner and non-pensioner households via our experimental household cost indices. We capture inflation from the business perspective. So our producer prices measure the change in price for the raw materials used in manufacturing, along with the cost of goods leaving the factory and services offered by businesses, which are our services producer price indices. Finally, we measure how much prices are increasing across the housing market via our house price index and the price index of private rents. And this will be our focus today at this webinar. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So why are housing indices difficult to measure? So understanding inflation in the housing market is important as it helps us understand housing affordability, supply and demand pressure in the housing market, and any risk building in the financial sector. So by analysing housing and rental price trends, policymakers can gain insights into economic conditions, supporting the development of sound policy decisions. So inflation matters as it affects us all, But when we talk about inflation, it's typically a broad measure, such as the overall increase in prices or the increase in the cost of living in a country. So most of our headline indices at the ONS measure inflation at this aggregate or macroeconomic level. However, housing is slightly different, as there is no single housing market. It's usually dictated by local conditions, so we need to provide housing measures of inflation at this local level. However, the production of house prices and rental price indices presents us with challenges, and we'll try to explain that in a bit more detail today. So it's worth just revisiting how we typically measure inflation at the ONS. So we measure inflation using what we call a matched model approach. This means we attempt to price to constant quality, which we mean like for like, so that any change in price is reflective of inflationary pressures, which we want to capture, and not changes in quality or the amount being sold. So let's take a basic consumer price index example using a t-shirt. So we pick a t-shirt in January, which costs us £10. We fix the price determining characteristics of this t-shirt, which could be the brand, the material, is it cotton or bamboo, the style, is it v-neck or is it crew neck? Effectively, everything that might determine or affect the price that you pay for that t-shirt. In February, we go back into the shop and we select the exact same t-shirt, ensuring it meets the same specification as January, and we reprice that t-shirt. We follow the same process in March, but this time we see the price is now £11. That's a 10% increase. All the characteristics are the same, so we could be confident this is a genuine inflationary increase in price, and then so on through the rest of the year. However, if during one of the months the t-shirt changed to a different material, so say it changed to organic cotton instead of acrylic, then we would expect to see a price change that's due to this change in quality, and we wouldn't want to reflect that in our price index. So bearing this in mind, we're just going to have an initial Slido. So I've just explained how we typically measure price change using the consumer price index. Can you perhaps provide us some thoughts on why you think estimating inflation for housing might be a bit more difficult? And please use the Slido. Okay, so yeah, we can't track the same property over time. That's certainly one of the biggest issues we've got. Demographics, each house is unique. Houses don't change, shortages, yeah, there's some excellent responses coming through on Slido. Prices vary all over the country. Some go up while others go down. That's another good example. Okay, there's pretty much a whole raft of excellent answers there. So I'll just go into a bit more detail now around why the housing market is very difficult for us to measure. So housing, regardless of whether we are measuring house prices or rent prices, are notoriously difficult to measure at constant quality, remembering we only want to capture price change. So why is this? Well, as a few people have correctly said on the Slido, the housing market is very heterogeneous or diverse, in other words, which means our preferred approach of measuring like for like doesn't really work. Each period, the mix of property that is selling or renting changes, and in some cases, this can be really significant. So, for example, each period, we see there are differences in the types of property that are selling, such as a terrace house one month, a flat in another month, or a large mansion the following month, and so on. Houses are different in size, so we could see changes in the number of rooms, the floor space, or even the size of the garden that's attached to the property. By default, each property occupies its own plot of land, so the location is always different. One of the key sayings in the housing market is location, location, location. Where the property is located can have a significant impact on the selling or rental price. Comparing different locations can greatly impact our measure price in the indices we produce. Houses can be quite different in states of repair as well, so the quality of each property can be significantly different. And then the final issue, which was also brought up, and this is more so for house sales than rents, is the lack of frequent sales. So a house typically isn't sold every month, so we can't directly capture the price paid for the same property month on month. So this means that our match model approach, the t-shirt example for the consumer price index, doesn't work well for housing. Next slide, please. So how does this impact the way we measure house prices then? So to understand this impact and how it kind of makes the measurement of inflation for house prices difficult, a quick example might help us. So similar to the t-shirt example for the consumer price index, we want to measure monthly price change for houses that have sold in the United Kingdom. we get data from the land registry on what properties have sold each month. So in January, we have mainly one-bedroom houses selling in Wales with an average selling price of around £150,000. We then move into February. Those houses don't sell anymore, and instead we find a lot of two-bedroom flats that are selling in London. This time, the average price is around £850,000. So straight away, you can see the issue. If we compare the average price in February with January, you are seeing a massive increase in price that is driven by a change in what is selling, the different property types and location, rather than pure price inflation, which is what we want to capture. So we can then extend this example. So in March, there is then a shift to large detached property selling in the southeast. This time, the average selling price is 1.5 million. Again, another massive increase in price that is not inflationary. Instead of capturing the pure price change, we're also reflecting the change in price due to change in quality, which means that the January average price of £150,000 is not directly comparable to the February price of £850,000, which is again not comparable to the March price of 1.5 million. So this measurement issue for housing is further exacerbated by the fact you can have multiple but correct prices for the same property during the same sale. So thinking first about property sales, there is an extended timeline for property sales with different valuations of property at each stage. So if we think about a typical sale in the UK, it starts with the property being advertised, which will give us the advertised price, and that's what the seller hopes to achieve for their property. So someone will then want to buy that property and they'll put in an offer which leads to the offer price. This could either be higher or lower than the advertised price depending on negotiations. If the property purchase is being financed by a mortgage, then the mortgage company or the bank will want to value the property, which gives us the valuation price. And then finally, once the sale is completed and the sale is registered with the land registry, we get the final completion price or the transaction price, which is what was actually paid for the property. It can take several months for the transaction price to be recorded, but this is the one we use at the ONS to reflect the actual price that is being paid for the property. So there are other measures of house prices produced by private sector companies, such as advertised prices by Rightmove, mortgage approval prices by Halifax and Nationwide. And taken together with the UK House Price Index, these all provide a comprehensive and complementary picture of how the property market is working in the UK. So now we'll move on to the issues with rental prices. So we get a lot of queries about the different rental prices that are published by the ONS and private sector measures such as HomeLet and Rightmove. This can be explained by distinguishing between the stock and the flow of rents. So for the rental market, we know there are people in long-term agreements where the rental price is fixed for a period of time, such as 12 months. These are what we refer to as existing rents. But there are also people taking out new rentals or renewing their agreements with landlords, and these are known as new rents. So these new rents are what's typically referred to as the flow, whilst the rents, both new and existing, are referred to as the stock of rents. And the average price will be different for the flow and the stock. So it helps if you think of the rental market as a bathtub of water. So for the stock of rents, we want to measure the temperature of the water in the tub to reflect the price of all rents, so both the existing rents and the new rents. However, for the flow, we would want to take the temperature of the water coming in from the hot tap. And in normal times, this temperature will be hotter than the tub as it reflects the immediate market conditions which long-term tenants don't initially experience. Okay, so it takes time for the hot water to affect the overall temperature of the tub. Indeed, the tub will never actually reach the exact temperature of the hot tap. At the ONS, we measure the tub temperature, whereas most private measures are taking the temperature of the tap. So these are the leading indicator of what may happen to the bathtub temperature. We see this behavior in our published statistics. So how the price index of private rents, which is the ONS measure of price inflation, is averaged over the entire stock of rents is less dynamic than inflation of newly advertised rents. So the chart on the screen shows how the hot water or the hot tap water from rapidly rising new rents in 2021 caused our Piper stock measure to slowly rise, but it took much longer for Piper, the annual inflation rate for Piper, to rise. And by late 2023, the temperature of the tap water was lower than the temperature of the tub. So Piper's stock measure never reached the same pace of growth that the flow measures did, because the tap water change started cooling the tub water. Amy will explain a bit more about how we measure Piper rents a bit later on. So all of the above present us with significant challenges in the compilation of constant quality price indices for housing. However, there are two well-recognised and internationally recommended approaches that allow us, as far as possible, to capture pure price change. So this can get quite complicated, but we'll just present a basic overview in this webinar today. So the first is what we call stratification with mixed adjustment. So in basic terms, this means we just try to group together like-for-like transactions into what we call strata. So each strata could be, a strata could be detached property within a local authority in Wales, for example. The properties within these strata are then fixed and given a weight that represents the relative value of transactions that have taken place over the previous 12 months. This approach helps account for the significant changes in what sells or rents each period. Secondly, we use what we call hedonic regression to model prices each month based on the latest transactions that are available. So hedonic regression is a statistical technique that sees the sale or rent of property as a bundle of individual characteristics, such as the number of rooms, the location, or the type of property. The regression will use the latest house sales or rents data to estimate the marginal contribution of each of these characteristics to an average price, allowing us to estimate a constant quality index. Again, Amy will explain a bit more about this later in the webinar. So I'll now give a quick overview of the main housing indices that we produce at the ONS, and then we'll have a short Slido quiz on average prices at the end of this section. So our main objective is to produce a measure of inflation for UK rents and house prices. That is how much the average rent or house price is changing over time, usually expressed as a percentage change. So if we say rental prices have increased by 5%, that means on average rental prices are 5% higher than this time last year. However, others want to know what the average price is, albeit what the average house price or the average rental price is. They also want to know this at a specific level, so whether that's based on local authority or the features of a house. As we've already seen, the average price in London is likely to be significantly different from an average price in Wales. Therefore, for housing, we also publish average price levels for rents and house prices, although these are a byproduct of the inflation measure. So our lead measure in each case is always the inflation statistic, or the percentage annual change in prices. So what do we publish then? So the first index we publish is what we call PIPER. That's the price index of private rents. We launched this for Great Britain in March 2024. So it's still official statistics in development. And then earlier this year, we added on Northern Ireland, and that allowed us to produce a UK-based measure. So each month we will present, or we'll publish the measure of inflation in terms of how much prices are changing over the year, and also the average price. And this is produced at a UK, a country, a region, and local authority or broad rental market area level. As I said, having that granularity for housing market indices is really important. As I explained with the bathtub analogy, PIPER is a stock-based measure, and it's taking the temperature of the bathtub of water. But there are some differences in data collection between countries just to be aware of. Next slide, please. And then on the house prices side, we produce the UK House Price Index. So this is a joint production by the ONS, the Land and Property Services of Northern Ireland, Her Majesty's Land Registry and Registers of Scotland. And the main publication of the UK House Price Index is on gov.uk each month. So the UK House Price Index measures the change in price of residential property that have taken place in the UK. And similar to the price index of private rents, we produce a monthly measure of inflation and average prices. And we produce this at a UK, national, region, county and local authority level. So again, giving users that granularity to understand what's happening in their local marketplace. So in terms of data availability, we've got England and Wales data from January 1995, Scotland from January 2004, and Northern Ireland from January 2005. So that's some of the basic ways that we produce house prices and rental prices and some of the issues that we experience. So we're just going to go into another Slido. So this time we're going to think about average house prices. And we're just going to ask the question, what is the most expensive local authority in the UK to purchase a property? And what do you think that average price is? So we'll just have a few minutes to think about where people think that's. So straight away, people are coming in with London, central London, Chelsea or Kensington. So we're getting a lot of information on where, but how about how much do you think that average price is? So you can see someone said 2.5 million, 1 million in the City of London, 1 million in Kensington and Chelsea. Richmond. So seems like a lot of people have been paying close attention to the statistics we produce, because you are in fact right that in March 2025, the most expensive local authority in our data set was Kensington and Chelsea, and that came in at an average price of 1.2 million. So again, it's an average price, so there will be prices that are considerably higher, prices that are lower, but on average the price in Kensington and Chelsea in March 2025 was 1.2 million. So we'll just flip that now and think about the least expensive local authority. This might be a bit more challenging, and again, remember this is the United Kingdom, so if you just give your thoughts on which local authority and what the actual average price is. So we've got Blackpool, Sunderland, Teesside, Port Talbot in Wales, Rochdale. So we've got Oldham at 100,000, average price of Bradford 125,000. So we're getting quite a few people saying north of the country. 90,000 in Middlesbrough, 40,000 someone's put in, somewhere in Wales 120,000. Okay, thanks. That's really some really good responses coming in there. So the actual answer was Inverclyde in Scotland. So in March 2025, Inverclyde in Scotland was the lowest average price, and that came in at an average of 108,000. So straight away you can see the differences between what's selling. I said earlier in the presentation, location. That has a huge impact on the average price that you generate from the property market. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Amy North, who leads on the production of house prices and rents, and she'll take you through some of the data sources and some of the methods that we use. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Amy North, and I'm the head of housing market indices at the Office for National Statistics. And a large part of my role is to lead the production and publication of ONS's monthly housing price statistics bulletin, which covers rent and house price statistics. So I'm going to cover data sources and summarize the methods we use to produce our key housing indices, which Chris has just mentioned, the House Price Index, HPI, and Piper for rents. So to produce our statistics, we need to access lots of data for use in our models. And most obviously, we need to know the price, whether that's the purchase price paid for a property or the monthly rental price that a tenant is paying a landlord. But to account for changes in composition and quality, so differences in the types of property selling or being rented month to month, we also need to know the characteristics or attributes of that property. So these represent the really important things that we look for when we're purchasing or renting a property. So we talked about some of them already, like location, the size of the property, whether it's a detached house or a flat, the affluence of the area, and some others as well. And we can't collect all of this data ourselves, so we use data that's already collected by other government departments, and they're collected for their own regulatory function. So whilst we are very grateful for this data, it does present us with some challenges. These administrative data collections were not designed for our use in measuring the property prices. So the way that the data is collected or processed may mean there are some delays getting the most up-to-date data that we need, or some information that we need may not be included in that data set. So we might need to link across multiple data sets to get all the information we need to know about a property. We also carry out quality assurance of the data before use, and details of all our data sources, their quality, and how we quality assure them is published on our website in our Quality Assurance of Administrative Data documentation, also known as QADS. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the House Price Index uses a wide range of data sources, and some of these include the house price data itself, which has information on the price, whether it's a new build or an existing build. And we get this price data from HM Land Registry for England and Wales, Registers of Scotland for Scotland, and Land and Property Services in Northern Ireland. Property attributes data, such as the number of rooms or the property type, we get this data from Valuation Office Agency and also from Scotland as well. And we also use something called ACORN. So this is CACI's ACORN socio-demographic classification, and it's a measure of affluence of the area. We use very similar administrative attributes data sources for our rent system, Piper. And some of the data sources we use include property attributes data from the Valuation Office Agency again, where we can get things like floor area and the property's age. We also use the Land and Property Service Northern Ireland's property attributes data set as well to collect similar information for Northern Ireland. We use CACI ACORN's measure of affluence as well in Piper, and then we get the rents price data from each of the four parts of the UK. So the Valuation Office Agency provides us with rent price data for England, Welsh Gov provides us with Wales data, Scottish Government for Scotland, and Northern Ireland Housing Executive for Northern Ireland. And rents data collection processes are different in each of the countries of the UK. So because of this, we advise caution when comparing our rents estimates between the countries. Next slide, please. So because we're trying to measure pure price change to account for the changing composition of the types of properties being sold or rented each month, we use a hedonic regression model and a fixed basket of properties in both Piper and HPI, as Chris mentioned. So the fixed basket is effectively a list of properties which represents the housing market at that point in time. And it has all the required information about each property, its property type, number of rooms, floor area, that sort of thing. So each year we will create a fixed basket for the year, and we do that for Piper and for the house price index separately. So for Piper, our rent statistic, this consists of over 500,000 privately rented properties, and for house price index, it will contain sales data for recent transactions. So for Piper, ideally we would be informed of the rent price that tenants are paying for every privately rented property every month. But in reality, this data is not available for all properties every month. So rent officers across the UK collect a sample of rents data. And they aim to collect data for about 10% of privately rented properties, which results in the over 500,000 rents data being collected each year across the UK. And our colleague Gary Trent will talk a bit later about the data collection process in England done by the Valuation Office Agency. So to build the fixed basket, each year we will take all the rents data that's been collected, for example, in 2024, and we'll keep only the latest record we have for each property. So that we make sure that each property appears only once in the fixed basket. So it's effectively a list of rented properties in the UK. And although rent officers take steps to target a representative sample of rents data, landlords and letting agents provide this data on a goodwill basis. So for us to publish rent estimates that are representative of the entire stock of rents across the UK, we apply weights to account for any potential over or under collection of rents across the UK in certain parts. So these weights are calculated separately using administrative and survey data sourced from various government sources. For the house price index, the fixed basket contains all property sales that have occurred in the previous 12-month period. Since our price paid data is a census of all sales that occurred, the basket itself is representative of the property market at that point in time, so we don't need additional weighting in the HPI. So now we've got our fixed basket of properties. What we want to know is how much is each property in our fixed basket worth each month? If it were being rented or sold in January, February, March, how much would each of these properties be marketed for, be rented or sold for? So to find this out for Piper and HPI separately, we combine the price data with our property attributes data, and we link this using the property's address to obtain all the information we can about that property. And each month we feed that data into a hedonic regression model. So for house prices, we take a calendar month worth of linked sales data, so all sales that occurred in March 2025, for example, and we fit a hedonic regression model on that 1 month of data to quantify the relationship between price and the property characteristics. So the regression model tells us things like, in January, people paid £20,000 more for a 4-roomed property than they did for a 3-roomed property. So we would assign that contribution to the price, that for that extra space, for that extra room, we would have a higher price of about £20,000 on average. So we use the regression model's results to predict what each property in that fixed basket list of properties, we predict what each property would have sold for on average in that month and the next month and so on. So, for example, if the model predicts that a 3-roomed terraced house in Cardiff would have sold for £200,000 in January, and that people pay £20,000 more for an extra room, then a 4-roomed terraced house in Cardiff in a fixed basket would have a predicted price of £220,000, £20,000 higher. We repeat this every month on that month's sales of data, and because we now end up with a predicted price for each property in the fixed basket every month, that means we have a predicted price for the same set of properties every month. And that means we've been able to strip out any quality changes from the exact type of property being sold, changing month to month. So we use these model prices to produce an index and inflation rates, growth rates from that, measuring the change in price over time. As Chris mentioned earlier, growth rates are our key measure, but some users are interested in average price levels. So what we do is we take the January 2023's predicted price of a reference set of properties, currently the 2023 fixed basket of properties, and we use the index to extrapolate that January 2023 price forwards and backwards in time. This ensures that the growth in the price level itself matches the growth that we've stated in our index and in the inflation rates. But it does mean the price levels themselves are dependent on the reference period used for this average price. For rents, the methodology is very similar, but the regression model that's run each month is based on 14 months of rents data instead of 1 month of data. We do this because in rents, we're trying to measure the stock, as Chris mentioned in the bathtub analogy earlier, instead of the flow. So we run it on the latest 14 months of data to predict how much we would have paid on average to rent that property in that month. And then we calculate indices in the same way as for HPI. And we use 14 months because rent price tends to stay the same for a period of time. The amounts a tenant is paying doesn't tend to change every month. So 14 months balances the average fixed term price for length of a rental agreement, and also the operational collection of rent prices, which Gary will tell us a little more about later. A 14-month period allows sufficient time for us to capture generally annual updates to rent prices without depleting our sample. So moving on to the results and tools, I'm going to give a high-level introduction to some of the outputs that we produce. So if we go to the next slide, we've got our first Slido question. Which English region saw the largest increase in house price between March 2024 and March 2025? So in the last year, which part of England do you think has seen the largest increase? You see London coming up a lot there. A few: Bristol, London South East, Northwest, Manchester. Yeah, some good guesses coming in here. Northeast, Southwest, Midlands, Somerset. I wonder if some of you are putting in your hometowns in the hope. Love pub quizzes. Marvellous. Right. Okay, so moving on to the answers. Whoever guessed the Northeast, you are correct. So the Northeast has grown 14.3% in the year to March 2025. This is average house price. This figure here has been taken from our latest month's bulletin, which was published last week. And we include some information to explain what's happening and why we think this is the case. So our bulletin reports that the English region with the highest annual inflation rate was the Northeast, and in April, stamp duty land tax rules changed in England and in Northern Ireland, and this increased the tax payable on properties valued above £125,000 for non-first-time buyers. It appears that the stamp duty changes led to sharp increases in price in March 2025. The 3 regions with the lowest average price had the highest annual growth. So the Northeast, Yorkshire and the Humber and the Northwest at the top, they tend to have the lowest average price in England, whereas the 3 regions with the highest average price, London, Southwest and the Southeast, showed the lowest price growth in the last year. So since the Northeast average price was £168,000, in March 2025, according to our statistics. For a large proportion of the properties sold in March, that means that the stamp duty fee would have been 0. But if they had sold 1 month later in April, the stamp duty would have needed to have been paid. Some element of stamp duty would have been due. So HMRC's estimates of sales volumes indicate that buyers rushed to complete house purchases in March to avoid the higher stamp duty fees from April. So this is the kind of explanation and the context we provide in our bulletin. Next question. Which local authority had the highest rent price in April 2025? Westminster, yes, an excellent first guess. Cambridge, yes, they do have high average prices for rents. Kensington and Chelsea, City of London. There's a general trend here for a lot of London. Yep, Chelsea and Poole, Edinburgh. Quite so. So yes, a lot of you guessed right. London by far has the highest average rent price consistently in our published statistics, and the answer is here. So this is extracted from the bulletin that we published last week. So the average rent price in April 2025 is highest in Kensington and Chelsea at £3,663 per month. It was lowest in Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland at £526 per month. And it's interesting to note that Kensington has grown above average for the London region in the last year. Last question. Which local authority saw the largest rent price increase, that's the percentage increase, in the last 5 years? So between April 2020 to April 2025, which area has seen a consistently fast growth? Bristol being popular here, Manchester, Hackney. Yeah, Brighton, Cardiff, Bromley. Leeds coming up there, yes. Okay, so I've not seen the answer come up just yet, so it might surprise some of you to know that the answer is Tameside in the northwest. So Tameside has had a whopping 52.7% growth in the last 5 years, between April 2020 and April 2025. So from this chart, this shows the annual inflation rate for Tameside as the dark blue line. The green line is the average for the northwest region as a whole. So you can see that Tameside saw rapid annual inflation for rent prices in 2021 and 2022, well above the northwest average. Growth slowed and fell below the northwest average in late 23, but since early 2024, Tameside has reported above annual inflation above the northwest average. So of all 400 odd local authorities in the UK, Tameside has experienced the largest over the last 5 years. Now, we've just seen Tameside experience the largest increase in rent price since April 2020, and that was calculated using the data set that we published alongside our bulletin. But we also have our housing prices in your area tool, which I'm going to show you now. You can link to this from our bulletin. There's a link in our bulletin. The URL was also shown on screen there, so everyone here today will be sent the slides after this presentation, so you'll be able to access it. Now the URL stays the same every month, so you will always be able to go back to this page to see what the latest statistics are for your area. So this tool has been designed to focus on local areas, hopefully for people such as yourselves who are interested in knowing what's happening in your local area. So for Tameside, for example, you have a choice. You can either type in Tameside here and press enter, and it will search and show you the Tameside's page. Or if you're not sure which area you're looking for, you can scroll down and we list all the local authorities in England and Wales here, as well as Scotland and Northern Ireland further down. And Wales as well, if I didn't already say Wales. So Tameside is in the northwest, so I can find Tameside in the list and click that, and it will take me to Tameside's page. This page is updated every month, simultaneously when we update our bulletin every month, and will always therefore show you our latest estimates for what's happening. So you can see the average house price for Tameside in March 2025 was £199,000. This was 2.3% up in the last year, lower than the Northwest average rise of 9.4%. It also shows you the rent price is £856 in April, with an annual increase of 11%, which, given what we just heard, is unsurprisingly is higher than the average rise for the Northwest at 8.4%. But it doesn't just show you the headline statistics, it shows you various breakdowns as well. So if you scroll down the page, you can see lots of charts and some statements explaining what's happening. So we've got the house price, annual inflation for Tameside, as well as breakdowns by the type of property in Tameside. So if you are interested, you can see that semi-detached and terraced houses have been growing at a faster rate than detached and flats in the last year. Gives you the average price in Tameside, broken down by property type, and then provides similar breakdowns for rents. So that's the chart we just saw before about the annual inflation rate for rent price in Tameside, and other breakdowns as well. For rents, we include a breakdown by bedroom category because we know that the number of bedrooms is important for users when it comes to rents. We also provide the property type breakdown. So at the bottom, there's a few more breakdowns, but at the bottom, we also include links to our monthly bulletin where you can read about wider context, such as the explanation I was just providing about the stamp duty changes and the impact that that had. There's also links to our quality and methodology information documents here for both our rents and house price measures, which will explain more information about the data sources and the methods we use. If you have any feedback, then you're free to contact us at hpi@ons.gov.uk. And I think I will stop there. Yep, I'll hand over to Gary now, joining us from the Valuation Office Agency. Thank you, Gary.
Hello. Yeah, my role is engaging with the private rented sector with a view to bringing some of this data in. And I was pleased to see on the Slido here that the top question is, or one of the top questions is, where does the rental data come from? So it was mentioned that it's administrative data. It is. It's collected for another purpose. Valuation Office Agencies, rent officers have several statutory roles. The old fair rents, which is a form of rent control, housing benefit, which is an old scheme of support for people in rented accommodation, and most importantly nowadays, local housing allowance. And that's what we need the data for. Local housing allowance requires us to collect a representative sample of private market rents. So that's rents in payment. We don't use advertisements. And we attempt to collect both new and renewal and Section 13 rent price change. So we can help track prices over time. It's collected across what's called broad rental market areas. And those broad rental market areas are based on access to services and facilities, not rent levels, and there are 152 in England. For each category of LHA, there's effectively a data set for each broad rental market area, so it's very targeted, and those categories are rooms, 1 beds, 2 beds, 3 beds, and 4 bed plus. The volumes, as mentioned earlier, are approximately 480 to 500,000. The target is 10% of the PRS based on the 2021 census. And we're currently running well above the 500,000. But as Amy said earlier, there's no legal obligation for anybody to provide that data. So sort of where does it come from and what's the value of this data set? So I'm going to start off with the value. The value of this data set is that it is unique. It's very much a holistic view of market rents because it does include those renewals and it does include Section 13s. Just because of the nature of how we need to collect, we do go back to sources and we effectively recollect. So you do get that tracking of price change over time. The bath analogy was a fantastic one with the tap. I would also say to you another analogy that I sometimes use is the iceberg. And if you think of the iceberg that you see above sea level, that's effectively the new rents. You hear a lot on media about rent changes on new rents, but what you don't see is what's happening below the sea level and the rest of the iceberg. Effectively, we are looking at the whole of the iceberg here. So we're looking at price change, not just of new rents, but of everything below the surface as well. So the existing rents for renewals and Section 13s. Where does that data come from? How do we collect it? It comes mainly from letting agents themselves. They will provide central reports from their databases. Sometimes they provide from their CRM software at branch level. And some of it's done on a personal contact where rent officers actually go into branch and discuss the market with the agent, and that's a really important part of the role, because we also need to understand the market to know that we are properly reflecting what's happening with the data that we collect. The data also comes from management companies, it comes from build to rent companies, it comes from landlords themselves, and we have an online form for data collection there, but we also go out and do a lot of events and attend landlord meetings and work with the likes of the NRLA, who represent landlords in the marketplace. We also get some data from alternative data sets, and that might be things like tenant reference companies, which are incredibly useful and very accurate data. And we also have access to the government's tenancy deposit protection data, which comes from 3 government approved schemes. I would say that it's an absolute credit to the private rented sector that we are able to collect this level of data and the diversity of the data that we do collect, because we are aiming to collect from as wide a range of sources as possible, so that no one single source dominates the data and can influence it, so that we get a really broad view of what's happening out there. And in fact, although it was called a purposive data set sample earlier on, what I would say is that we put a huge amount of effort into the data collection itself in terms of planning it. We have a lot of analysis tools in the background that show us the data being collected and the price change, and we obviously relate it to other intelligence in the market. That's both coming from the rent officer conversations and from other data out there. We do a huge amount of quality assurance on a monthly basis. And we also have tools to help us with recollection. So rent officers have prompts out there, and we always, where we can, update records. The data collection is done on a rolling monthly basis. So it's done throughout a 12-month period. So there's not like one big collection. It's fairly even throughout the whole 12 months. And obviously that collection is really, really important for the statutory purposes, the local housing allowance, but feeds into this as an administrative data set. The Piper statistics that are now that were described earlier are really important for us, but also for a lot of people across the sector. It's used for policy making within government, so it informs government and it gives them an idea of what the market is doing. It also supports growth and development of the PRS. There's an open government license on it, so it's used commercially by quite a lot of companies out there who provide services to anyone operating within the PRS. It's used by PRS analysts, it's used by consultants, advisors, researchers, and it's also used by lobbyists and pressure groups. It is a resource for everyone, not just for government, right from the small individual landlord who wants to look at rental prices and inflation of rental prices, right up to government level. Local authorities also find it incredibly useful. We use it as an engagement tool, so things like the maps, it's effectively our way of showing the value that people are giving us for providing the data. So we're actually giving something back to them, and it's used in presentations and meetings, etc. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Chris, Amy and Gary for the insight into the work that you do at the ONS and the VOA. We're now going to move on to our Q&A section for the rest of today's event, where we'll have time to go through the questions that you have asked. We'll be answering questions in order of popularity, so please do upvote the questions that you most want answered. And so that we have a balance of questions for all of our speakers, I may also pick on some more recent ones. If we don't have time to answer your question today, you can always get in touch with us at engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk. So on to our questions. The most popular one that's come through is, what is the most popular month for house sales? Chris and Amy, not sure if you can answer that.
Yeah, so generally summer is generally when we tend to see a spike in house price sales compared to winter, particularly over Christmas. Listers tend to close for 2 weeks over the Christmas break. So we generally get more house sales in summer, and occasionally when we have changes to stamp duty, like we were just talking about earlier.
Perfect. Thanks, Amy. Mark has asked, where does your rental price data come from? A questionnaire to whom? I think that was an earlier question, so I know that's broadly been covered, but I don't know, Amy, if you want, or Chris, you want to kind of provide a summary of that?
Yeah, it's not a survey or questionnaire. So as Gary said, Valuation Office Agency rent officers collects data for government on rents in England. So we get equivalent data sets for rent prices from the other 3 countries of the UK. Data collection processes differ a little bit between each country. So I suggest you have a look at our quality and methodology information where it's described in more detail. Chris?
Perfect, thank you. Is there any plan to separate the number of room statistics into flats and houses? At the moment, we can see the rental cost by room number or by property type, but there is a big difference between a 1-bedroom flat and a 1-bedroom house.
Yeah, so yeah, Chris, would you like to take it?
Yeah. So ideally we publish the data as granular as possible, but there's a balance between how granular you can cut the data and how volatile the estimates will be due to the number of records that are available to allow us to produce robust statistics. So if we did try to break down Piper, our rental index, by number of rooms, by property type, we're likely to get quite a lot of noise in the data that just isn't suitable. So we made a decision to produce the index at a slightly more aggregated level, but hopefully still at a useful level that you can understand those kind of price developments in terms of what's happening with flats and houses.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Perhaps one for all of you. So Hassan has asked, how are the housing and rent statistics being used to shape local and national housing affordability policies?
Yeah, perhaps I'll go first. So typically we don't make policy, the ONS, or we don't make policy, but we know that our statistics are used heavily to inform the various macroeconomic and fiscal policies. I guess what I would say is that if, in terms of making good policy, you need a lot of information, particularly on housing market at the more local level, so you understand what's happening across the country, but also at the local level, and that's kind of where we really push to redevelop our price index of private rents, because previously the previous measure, which was the index of private housing rental prices, was only published at a regional level, and that didn't really support effective decision making, because as I said at the start of the presentation, location is one of the biggest kind of drivers of price change. So we really tried to develop this new index in the same with the UK house price index at this granular level, so that policymakers understand what is happening at these local levels across the country.
Perfect. Thank you, Gary. Not sure if you wanted to come in at all, if there's any insight you could share. You're on mute if you do.
Only that the likes of obviously MHCLG will use this as a resource, so sort of at the higher levels, but we do know that local authorities also use them in terms of things like local plans, and some instances local authorities also use them for some of the legal work that they have to do, and they need to understand the market and they need data to support that. So it's used quite widely, but I can't comment specifically on the question there on housing affordability policies.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Chris. Next is an anonymous question. Does council tax banding affect the data where some houses are on an incorrect band? So
perhaps I can start on this one. It shouldn't do, because Amy's explained we use council tax data, but we use that in terms of the attributes. So when the data is collected, it can provide us information on the attributes of the property, the size of the property, the number of rooms, and not necessarily the banding. So we don't feed the band into our model. It's more about the information the council tax data is giving us about that property, which we then use to try and compile our indices on a constant quality basis. Is that okay, Amy?
Yes, that's correct. We don't use the actual council tax band itself.
Okay, perfect. Thanks both. Jaroslav, apologies if I've mispronounced your name. Okay, so we know that the house prices are several times higher in Kensington and Chelsea than in Inverclyde, but do we know exactly why? At what point house prices become high only because the other houses in the area are expensive?
So this is a really interesting question. Perhaps Chris, if I start and you carry on. So we use our data to record what we're observing, or what we observe the house prices are, but that doesn't necessarily tell us why. So the example I talked about earlier with the stamp duty changes that happened recently is a really good example of this, because we can see that house prices have risen rapidly in the northeast, northwest, for example, but the data alone that we have wouldn't have told us why. But our wider understanding of in this case, a policy change for stamp duty fees can provide us with that wider knowledge and that context to put this in perspective. So looking at the data alone, no. Our model tells us that prices in Kensington and Chelsea tend to be higher than Inverclyde, but that doesn't necessarily tell us why, and we do sometimes have to use alternative sources to enrich our understanding of what's going on.
Perfect. Thank you. Anonymous has said, I'm in Inverclyde. Anyone want a 3-bed with a fabulous view? So I think that's in reference to the area where prices are lowest. Thank you, Anonymous. I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. So how much detail goes into the baskets of properties? For example, do you consider that a 2-bedroom house with a garage, driveway and garden might actually cost more than a 3-bedroom house in the same area without those desirable features?
Yes, so this is a really good question. So we, in an ideal world, would know everything about every property and have all the data we would need to cover all the aspects of that price determining decision. So yes, I haven't mentioned in the variables earlier, garage, driveway, garden as being included in our data currently. So those specific examples there we don't currently include, and it is possible, in some cases likely, that the presence or not of some of these features could impact the price. So our statistical model runs on the data using the variables we have and we've asked it to consider, and it will produce the average price as best it can based on what it knows. But there is going to be a statistical error term, which is everything the model doesn't know, and that could include things like whether there's a garage or a garden or a shop nearby, for example. So in an ideal world, if the model knows everything that influences our decision on how much we're willing to pay, then it should predict that price exactly. But if there's some aspects it doesn't know, then it could struggle.
Okay, thanks, Amy. I think we have one question that came through for Gary. Do you get data from web platforms like OpenRent, Spare Rooms, etc.?
We don't, because Spare Room is a portal effectively, and they don't have the achieved rents. They only have the asking rents. But I do meet regularly with Spare Room to have discussions about the market itself, so some insight about the room market and what's happening. We can't really discuss the individual sources that we do collect from, but some of them will be similar to OpenRent.
Perfect, thank you. I think that's all we have time for now today for our questions. So if we didn't get to them, again, you can email us at engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk. Thank you so much for your questions, and to Chris, Amy and Gary for your thoughtful responses and your time today. Before we close, I'd just like to mention that we have 3 more events now available to register on Eventbrite. The QR code on the screen will take you to our page. For the next events, we'll be shifting the focus to population statistics in June, migration in July, and then onto GDP in September. These webinars are free to join and they will be recorded. Before you go, we'd also be really grateful if you could share how you found today's event. This can all be done on the Slido page that you've been using, where our quick survey will be live, and we'll also send you a link to this survey once we finish. So thanks again to Chris, Amy and Gary for your presentations, and thanks to everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.